a veterinarian rescues a tiny trembling puppy abandoned on a remote trail. At first, he thinks he's just saving another innocent life, but something about this creature is different. Oversized eyes, spindly legs, and wild instincts leave him questioning everything he knows. Then, the DNA results come back, and his entire world is turned upside down. This isn't a puppy at all. But what is it? And how far will he go when he's forced to make a decision that could change his life and the creature's forever? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Archer Knowles rubbed his tired eyes and leaned back in his worn office chair. The clock on the wall showed 8:45 p.m., well past closing time at the Willow Creek Veterinary Clinic. Only the soft buzz of fluorescent lights and the steady tick-tock of the clock kept him company. His coffee, now barely warm, sat neglected beside a stack of patient files. "Just need to finish Mrs. Henderson's notes," he mumbled to himself, scribbling observations about her cat's latest arthritis treatment. The old tabby had been struggling with joint pain, and Archer wanted to make sure the new medication dosage was properly documented. The shrill ring of the phone cut through the quiet, making him jump. His hand knocked against the coffee mug, nearly spilling it. "Willow Creek Vet Clinic," he answered, stifling a yawn. "Archer, it's Peter Mitchell." The outdoorsman's usually steady voice carried an edge of worry. "Found what looks like an abandoned puppy out on the old logging trail. Poor thing's barely moving. Found it curled up next to a fallen log." Archer sat up straighter, his exhaustion forgotten. "How does it look?" "Not good. It's tiny, shaking something awful. Never seen one quite like it." "Bring it in," Archer said firmly. "I'll wait here." 20 minutes later, Peter burst through the clinic doors, cradling something wrapped in his red flannel jacket. Archer had already prepped the exam room, and Kate, his assistant who lived nearby, had arrived to help. Under the bright examination lights, Archer carefully unwrapped the trembling bundle. What he saw made him pause. The creature was small enough to fit in his palms, but its features were unlike any puppy he'd treated before. Its eyes seemed too large for its face, and its legs were unusually thin and delicate. The skin showed through patches of sparse fur. "Kate, we need to start fluids right away," Archer directed, his gentle hands checking vital signs. "Temperature's low. Let's get the incubator ready." They worked efficiently together, moving around each other with practiced ease. Kate prepared the fourth while Archer continued his examination, noting each unusual feature with growing curiosity. "Poor little thing," Kate murmured as she helped set up the warming incubator. What could have happened to it? Once they had the creature stabilized and settled in the incubator, Archer stood watching it through the clear plastic walls. Its chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, its oversized eyes now closed in fitful sleep. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting shifting shadows across its strange form. "What are you?" Archer whispered, studying the mysterious patient that had arrived at his clinic on this quiet evening. The early morning sun had barely crept over the horizon when Archer pulled into the clinic's parking lot. His mind had been on the mysterious creature all night, leaving him tossing and turning instead of getting proper rest. As he unlocked the front door, soft whimpers echoed from the back room. "Hey there, little one," he said softly, approaching the incubator. The creature's breathing was still shallow, its tiny body trembling despite the controlled temperature. Kate arrived moments later, her footsteps quick and purposeful. "I couldn't sleep thinking about our patient," she admitted, setting her bag down. "How's it doing?" "Still critical. Let's check its vitals and try some formula." They worked in sync, moving around each other with practiced efficiency. Kate prepared the specialized formula, while Archer gently lifted the creature to check its temperature. Under the bright morning light streaming through the windows, Kate noticed details that had been harder to see in last night's fluorescent glare. "Archer," she said, frowning as she studied the pup, "have you noticed its muzzle? It's longer than a normal puppy's." Her fingers ghosted over its head. "And these ears, they're so triangular." Archer barely glanced up from his examination. "Probably birth defects or signs of malnutrition. We see all sorts of deformities in abandoned animals." Kate didn't seem convinced, but focused on warming the formula to the right temperature. Using a small syringe, they carefully fed the creature, watching as it accepted the nourishment with surprising eagerness despite its weakness. "That's it," Archer encouraged, making detailed notes about the feeding response. "It's showing good signs. Survival instinct is strong." He jotted down measurements and observations, creating a thorough record of every unusual feature. "I'll need to research some rare breeds later. There might be something in the literature about these characteristics." Throughout the morning, between regular appointments, they took turns checking on their fragile patient. Despite its critical condition, the creature showed remarkable determination, accepting each feeding with growing strength. As Kate adjusted the incubator's temperature in the afternoon, the pup suddenly let out a high-pitched yip, a sound that made her smile widely. "You've got some fight in you, don't you?" Archer looked up from his detailed notes, startled by the strange sound. The midday sun streamed through the clinic windows as Archer hurried between exam rooms. Mrs. Peterson's golden retriever needed vaccines, and the Martinez family's cat was due for a checkup. Between patients, he found himself drawn back to the mysterious pup in the incubator. "Looking stronger already," he muttered, noting the creature's improved breathing and more stable temperature. The tiny patient had taken well to the formula, and its vital signs were slowly but steadily improving. Kate organized files at the front desk when movement caught her eye. Through the observation window, she watched the pup's head turn, following a fly that buzzed near the incubator. Its oversized eyes tracked her as she walked into the room to check its feeding schedule. "Well, look who's more alert," she said softly. The pup's gaze remained fixed on her, unnervingly focused for such a young animal. Later that afternoon, during a brief lull between appointments, Archer took advantage of the quiet to conduct a more thorough examination. He lifted the pup gently from the incubator, noting how it tensed at his touch. Under the bright exam lights, the creature's unusual features seemed even more pronounced. "These aren't normal puppy characteristics," he mumbled, carefully examining the elongated muzzle and distinctive triangular ears. The paw structure particularly caught his attention. There was something off about the way the digits were arranged. Settling at his computer, Archer began searching through veterinary databases. He pulled out well-worn textbooks from his shelves, flipping through pages of breed characteristics and congenital conditions. Nothing matched the unique combination of features he observed. The pup's behavior grew more concerning as the afternoon wore on. When Kate approached with fresh bedding, it snapped at her shadow, backing into a corner of the incubator. Later, as Archer reached in to check its temperature, a soft but distinct growl rumbled from its throat. "That's not typical domestic puppy behavior," Archer said, making another note in the growing file. He watched as the creature paced restlessly in its enclosure, its movements sharp and unpredictable. After an hour of fruitless research, Archer closed another reference book with a heavy sigh. The pup had finally settled, curling into a tight ball in the warmest corner of the incubator. Its large eyes remained half open, watching him with what seemed like wary intelligence. "You're a mystery, that's for sure," he murmured, as those unusual eyes slowly drifted closed. Mrs. Henderson shuffled into the clinic, her arthritic hands clutching her cat carrier. The elderly tabby inside meowed softly as Kate greeted them with a warm smile. As they made their way to exam room 2, Mrs. Henderson's eyes wandered to the back of the clinic where the incubator hummed quietly. She stopped abruptly, her eyes widening behind thick glasses. The creature inside shifted, revealing its unusual features in the fluorescent light. Mrs. Henderson let out a sharp gasp, nearly dropping her cat carrier. "Good heavens! What in the world is that?" Her voice quavered. Archer quickly stepped between her and the incubator, gently guiding her toward the exam room. "Just a sick puppy we're nursing back to health, Mrs. Henderson. Nothing to worry about. Now, how has Arthur's arthritis been?" But word spread through Willow Creek like wildfire. By 3 o'clock, Lisa had fielded dozens of calls from curious locals. "Mrs. Baker wants to schedule her dog's annual checkup," she told Archer between appointments, rolling her eyes. But she spent 10 minutes asking about the strange creature everyone's talking about. The afternoon brought a steady stream of visitors. Mr. Thompson came in claiming his cat needed vaccines, though its records showed they were up to date. Sarah from the diner stopped by with coffee for the staff, her eyes scanning the back room hopefully. Peter Mitchell's arrival provided a welcome break from the parade of nosy visitors. He leaned against the reception desk, his weathered face creased with concern. "How's our little friend doing?" Archer led him to the incubator. "Better, but something's not adding up. Tell me again how you found it." Peter ran a hand through his gray hair. "It was strange. No tracks around except its own tiny prints. Found it huddled under that fallen oak on the north logging trail. No sign of a mother or litter mates, just this little one, all alone." He shook his head. "Been walking those woods 30 years. Never seen anything quite like it." The story sent a chill down Archer's spine. The pup's isolation, its unusual features, its wild behavior, none of it made sense for a domestic animal. Later that night, after the last curious visitor had gone, Archer moved through the darkened clinic, checking locks and turning off lights. The pup's soft whimpers followed him as he worked, its tiny voice echoing in the empty building. Standing in the parking lot, he looked up at the star-filled sky, then turned toward the distant tree line. Somewhere out there, along that remote logging trail, lay answers about his mysterious patient. The dark woods seemed to hold their secrets close, leaving him with more questions than answers. The early morning sun cast long shadows through the clinic windows as Archer leaned over the incubator. His practiced hands moved gently, checking the pup's temperature and heart rate. The tiny creature stirred, its tail making a feeble wagging motion at the sound of his voice. "Good morning, little one," he murmured, noting the improved vitals on his chart. Kate walked in, the aroma of fresh coffee trailing behind her. She paused beside Archer, her eyes brightening at the sight of their unusual patient. "Look at you. Someone's feeling better today." The pup's ears twitched at her cheerful tone. "The difference from 3 days ago is remarkable," Archer said, straightening up. "I think it's time we get some real answers." With steady hands, he drew a small blood sample, while Kate kept the pup calm with gentle strokes. The creature barely flinched, seeming to trust them more with each passing day. Archer carefully labeled the vial and prepared it for courier delivery to Paula's lab in the city. Throughout the day, Archer found himself distracted during routine appointments. Mrs. Johnson's golden retriever needed vaccines, and the Martinez family brought in their new kitten for a checkup. But his thoughts kept drifting back to the mysterious pup. The evening sun was setting when Paula's call came through. Archer put her on speaker so Kate could listen. "Archer, I've never seen anything quite like this." Paula's voice crackled through the phone. "The genetic markers, they're unusual. Some sequences don't match any domestic dog breed in our database." Kate leaned forward, her eyes wide. "What does that mean?" "I'm not entirely sure," Paula replied. "But whatever this creature is, it's not your typical domestic dog. I'd like to run more comprehensive tests." After hanging up, Kate turned to Archer. "Do you think—" She started, then stopped herself. Archer shook his head. "Let's not jump to conclusions. We need more data." But as the evening wore on, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were dealing with something extraordinary. He sat at his desk, surrounded by open textbooks and his laptop displaying various research papers. The soft glow of the screen illuminated his furrowed brow as he searched for answers. A small yip drew his attention. The pup was watching him from its incubator, those unusually large eyes gleaming in the dim light. As Archer watched, it curled back into its blanket, tucking its nose under its tail. "What are you hiding?" he whispered, frustration and curiosity mingling in his voice. The morning brought a visitor to Willow Creek Veterinary Clinic. Dr. Sher Novak's mud-splattered SUV pulled into the parking lot, its wheels crunching on the gravel. She emerged carrying a sleek black case, her practical field clothes showing signs of recent outdoor work. "Archer," she greeted warmly, extending her hand. "Thanks for reaching out." Inside the clinic, Dr. Novak set her case on the examination table, methodically arranging her diagnostic tools. The pup watched from its incubator, more alert now than in previous days. "Let's take a look at our mystery patient," she said, pulling on latex gloves. With practiced movements, Dr. Novak lifted the pup onto the exam table. She measured its body length, checked its developing teeth, and observed how it moved. The creature remained surprisingly calm under her expert touch. "Notice these proportions," she said, pointing to the pup's elongated muzzle. "And these triangular ears. They're distinctive." She made detailed notes in her journal. "These aren't characteristics we typically see in domestic breeds." Kate leaned closer, fascination evident on her face. "Based on these initial observations," Dr. Novak continued, "I believe we're looking at a coyote pup. Of course, we'll need the DNA results to be certain." Archer's shoulders tensed. "A coyote?" Dr. Novak nodded, her expression turning serious. "Which brings up some concerns. There are strict regulations about keeping wildlife, even for rehabilitation purposes. The longer it stays here, the more complicated things become." "When it arrived, it was barely alive," Archer said, his voice firm. "It needed immediate care." "I understand, Doctor," Novak replied gently. "Your instincts to help were right. But moving forward, we need to be careful. Minimize handling to prevent overbonding, and start considering contact with wildlife authorities. They have the proper facilities and expertise for wild animal rehabilitation." She packed her equipment with careful precision, promising to return once the DNA results arrived. After she left, Archer stood by the incubator, watching the pup playfully gnaw on a small towel. Its tiny teeth tugged at the fabric with surprising vigor. Kate moved to stand beside him. "She might be right, Archer, but it doesn't feel wild, does it?" Archer remained silent, his thoughts tangled with uncertainty as he watched the small creature at play. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the clinic's windows as Archer watched the pup's determined efforts to walk. Its tiny legs trembled with each step, wobbling like a newborn fawn on ice. The creature took 3 shaky steps before tumbling sideways onto the soft blanket beneath it. "Come on, little one," Archer murmured encouragingly. The pup responded with a high-pitched yip and struggled back to its feet, tail wagging with determination. A smile crept across Archer's face despite his professional resolve. Over the next few days, the clinic became the pup's playground. It followed Archer and Kate everywhere, its confidence growing with each passing hour. During quiet moments between appointments, Kate observed its peculiar behaviors with growing fascination. "Archer, look at this," she whispered one morning, pointing to where the pup crouched low, stalking a piece of paper that had fallen from the reception desk. Its movements were precise, calculated, nothing like the playful pouncing of a domestic puppy. Later that week, when a metal tray clattered to the floor, the pup's reaction was instant. A freeze response followed by a defensive growl. These wild instincts became more apparent each day, impossible to ignore. Archer spent hours documenting everything in his notebook. Weight gains, behavioral changes, feeding patterns. His detailed notes filled page after page. But between the clinical observations, his personal attachment grew stronger. "We should give it a name," Kate suggested one afternoon while watching the pup chase its own shadow. "It feels weird just calling it the pup all the time." Archer's pen paused mid-sentence. "I don't think that's a good idea," he said softly, though his heart wasn't in the refusal. The clinic's phone rang constantly with curious locals trying to schedule unnecessary appointments. Mrs. Peterson brought her perfectly healthy cat in for its third checkup that week, clearly hoping to catch a glimpse of the mysterious creature. "I heard it might be something exotic," she pressed, trying to peek past the reception desk. Kate expertly steered her back to the waiting room. "Just a sick puppy, Mrs. Peterson. Nothing unusual." That evening, as the clinic quieted down, Archer sat in his office chair with the pup cradled in his hands. It had fallen asleep, completely trusting, its tiny body curled against his palm. The creature's whiskers twitched as it dreamed, and Archer found himself memorizing every detail of its face. Kate appeared in the doorway, watching the scene with knowing eyes. "You're getting attached," she said quietly. Archer sighed, still gazing at the sleeping pup. "How could I not?" The clinic was silent except for the soft padding of tiny paws and the occasional rustle of paper. Archer leaned against his desk, watching the pup stalk a crumpled ball that Kate had tossed in its enclosure before leaving. Its movements were precise, calculated, nothing like the clumsy play of a regular puppy. The creature's eyes locked onto the target, its body low to the ground, before launching forward with startling speed to catch its prey. As the days passed, the pup's wild nature became increasingly apparent. During a routine checkup, the sharp slam of a car door outside made it bare its tiny teeth and growl, a sound that sent chills down Archer's spine. It wasn't just the defensive reactions that concerned him, it was the way the pup's ears would prick up at distant sounds, especially in the evenings when faint howls echoed from the surrounding wilderness. Peter's story about finding the pup alone on the logging trail kept nagging at Archer's thoughts. One morning, he called Peter and proposed a return visit to the site. "I need to understand where this little one came from," he explained. "I'll take you there," Peter agreed readily. "The trail's tricky if you don't know it." Before they could finalize plans, Kate overheard and firmly stated, "I'm coming too." Her tone left no room for argument. The next afternoon, the three of them hiked along the narrow logging trail. Peter led the way, pointing out landmarks he remembered from that night. The forest was dense here, old-growth pines towering overhead, their branches casting dappled shadows on the ground. "Here," Peter said, stopping near a massive fallen log. "This is where I found it." They spread out, searching the area carefully. Archer noticed deep claw marks scoring the bark of several trees, too high for the pup to have made them. Kate discovered scattered animal bones, rabbit and deer, bleached white by the sun. Behind the fallen log, partially hidden by thick undergrowth, they found a shallow den. "No signs of other pups," Kate observed, her voice quiet. "No mother either." Archer knelt by the den, running his hand along the packed earth. The silence of the forest pressed in around them, broken only by the distant call of a bird. Standing up, he looked at his companions, the reality of the situation settling heavily on his shoulders. "Whatever this is," he said, glancing between Kate and Peter, "it doesn't belong in a clinic. It belongs here." Peter nodded solemnly, but Kate's face clouded with uncertainty, her eyes reflecting the conflict Archer felt in his own heart. The drive back to the clinic was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts about what they'd discovered on the logging trail. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the clinic windows as Archer carefully placed the pup back in its enclosure. He leaned against the counter, running a hand through his hair, the image of those deep claw marks on the trees still fresh in his mind. "Those weren't regular dog marks," Kate said, breaking the silence. She perched on a nearby stool, her usual cheerful demeanor subdued. Peter nodded, his weathered face serious. "Been seeing more wildlife activity lately, especially up near Wheeler's Ridge?" He shifted his weight, hands in his pockets. "Coyotes, mostly. Folks have spotted them more often than usual." Kate's eyes widened slightly. "Coyotes? This close to town?" "Nature's pushing back," Peter explained. "With all the new development on the east side, animals are getting squeezed into smaller territories." He glanced at the pup, which was now sniffing the air intently. "Makes you wonder what happened to its family." "That's what bothers me," Archer said. "No siblings, no mother. It doesn't add up. Wild animals don't usually abandon their young without good reason." The conversation stayed with Archer as the day wound down. After Peter left and Kate headed home, he sat in his office, the only sound the gentle hum of the heating system. Dr. Novak's words about wild animals echoed in his mind, mixing with memories of the pup's recent behavior, the stalking, the defensive growling, its intense reaction to distant sounds. A high-pitched yip broke through his thoughts, then another. The pup was pacing its enclosure, nose pointed toward the window, letting out sharp calls that bounced off the clinic walls. It moved with purpose now, nothing like the weak creature Peter had brought in that first night. Archer pulled Paula's preliminary blood work from his desk drawer, spreading the papers out under his desk lamp. His fingers drummed against the wood as he waited for the final confirmation that would arrive tomorrow. The pup yipped again, more insistent this time. "Whatever you are," Archer whispered, watching the creature's restless movements, "I'm going to find out." The morning sun filtered through the clinic windows as Archer sorted through the day's appointment files. Mrs. Peterson's elderly retriever needed vaccinations, and the Martinez family was bringing in their new kitten for a checkup. Just another ordinary Tuesday, until the phone rang. Paula's name flashed on the caller ID. Archer's hand hesitated over the receiver, his stomach tightening into a knot. Taking a deep breath, he answered. "Archer, I have those DNA results you've been waiting for." Paula's voice was gentle but professional. "I ran the test twice to be absolutely certain." He gripped the edge of his desk. "And it's a pure coyote, Archer. No trace of domestic dog DNA at all." She paused. "I'm sorry for the delay, but I wanted to be thorough. You understand you'll need to notify wildlife authorities, right?" The confirmation hit him like a physical weight. He'd known deep down, but hearing it made everything real. "Yes, I understand. Thanks, Paula." Kate walked in carrying fresh coffee, but stopped short when she saw his face. "What's wrong?" That was Paula. Archer rubbed his temples. The DNA results came back. Our mystery pup? It's a coyote. Pure coyote. Kate set down her coffee, her shoulders dropping. "Oh." She was quiet for a moment, then straightened up. "We should call Doctor Novak. She'll know exactly what steps we need to take." "You're right," Archer nodded, though his chest felt heavy. "The sooner the better, given the legal situation." "I know this is hard," Kate said softly. "I've seen how much time you've spent with it. Those late nights when it was so sick." Memories flooded back, the tiny creature trembling in his hands as he fed it with a dropper, the way it had fought to survive despite everything, hours spent monitoring its breathing, celebrating each small improvement. Now all those moments felt like borrowed time. Archer walked to the back room where the pup was housed. It had grown significantly in the past weeks, its fur thicker, its movements more confident. As he watched, it grabbed a small towel in its teeth, shaking it back and forth with playful vigor. "You're not mine to keep," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. The pup stopped its game and looked up at him, head tilted to one side, as if trying to understand the sadness in his words. The next morning brought a crisp autumn chill and 2 unexpected visitors to Willow Creek Veterinary Clinic. Ranger Morris and Officer Klein from the State Wildlife Department stood in the waiting room, their green uniforms stark against the clinic's pale walls. Archer straightened his white coat and extended his hand, maintaining a professional smile, despite the nervous flutter in his stomach. "Dr. Knowles," Ranger Morris said, her handshake firm, "we're here about the coyote pup you've been treating." In the examination room, Officer Klein crouched near the enclosure, studying the pup's movements. The young coyote paced, its nails clicking against the floor. "Definitely a coyote," he confirmed, noting details in his clipboard. "About 6 weeks old, I'd estimate." Ranger Morris turned to Archer. "Dr. Knowles, while we appreciate your efforts to save this animal, keeping a wild creature without proper permits is a serious violation." "I understand," Archer said, his voice steady. "When Peter Mitchell brought it in, it was severely dehydrated and struggling to breathe. It wouldn't have survived the night without immediate care." Kate stood nearby, her arms crossed tightly across her chest as she watched the exchange. "We're not here to punish anyone," Officer Klein added, his tone softening. "But protocols exist for a reason. This pup needs specialized care from licensed wildlife rehabilitators." Ranger Morris pulled out some paperwork. "You have 3 days to arrange transfer to a certified wildlife rehabilitation center. Here's a list of approved facilities." After the officers left, Kate and Archer stood in the sudden quiet of the exam room. The pup had settled in its blanket, watching them with alert eyes. "I can help contact the centers," Kate offered, touching Archer's arm gently. "Maybe start with Pine Ridge? They've got a good reputation." Archer nodded, grateful for her support. "Thanks, Kate." That evening, long after Kate had gone home, Archer sat at his desk. The computer screen cast a blue glow across his tired face as he composed an email to Pine Ridge Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. The pup's soft whimpers drew his attention, and he watched as it curled tighter into its blanket, nose tucked under its tail. Archer's eyes stung as he returned to typing, each keystroke bringing him closer to saying goodbye. The morning sun had barely crept over the horizon when Archer pulled into the clinic's parking lot. His headlights caught Kate's figure waiting by the door, 2 steaming coffee cups in her hands. They shared a quiet nod before heading inside, both knowing what the next 3 days would bring. Inside, the pup greeted them with excited yips, its tail wagging as they approached the enclosure. Archer checked its water bowl while Kate measured the morning formula. "Temperature's good," Archer noted, adjusting the heating pad slightly. "How's our formula supply?" Kate opened a cabinet, counting containers. "Enough for the next few days. I'll portion it out for transport, too." The phone rang mid-morning, making them both jump. Archer answered, recognizing the rehabilitation center's number. "Dr. Knowles?" "This is Sarah from Pine Ridge," a warm voice said. "I wanted to discuss the coyote pup's transfer arrangements." Archer listened intently as Sarah explained their facilities, specially designed enclosures, experienced wildlife handlers, and a proven track record of successful releases. Her words were reassuring, but they still felt like weights on his chest. Throughout the day, Archer and Kate worked methodically. Kate labeled containers of formula, while Archer organized medical records, detailing every treatment and observation since the pup's arrival. The phone kept ringing with curious locals, each call a reminder of how quickly news traveled in Willow Creek. "No, Mrs. Peterson, we can't allow visitors," Kate explained for the third time that afternoon. "It's a protected wild animal." The pup remained blissfully unaware of the activity around it, focused on attacking a towel with playful determination. During feeding time, it eagerly lapped at the formula, occasionally pawing at Archer's hands for more. Each interaction twisted the knot in Archer's stomach tighter. As darkness fell outside, Archer performed his final check of the day. He carefully placed fresh blankets in the enclosure, making sure everything was perfect. The pup pressed against his hand as he smoothed the bedding, its fur soft beneath his fingers. "You've come so far," he whispered, his voice catching. The pup looked up at him with those bright eyes that had captured his heart weeks ago. From the doorway, Kate watched silently, wiping tears from her cheeks as the pup nuzzled trustingly into Archer's hand. The morning brought a steady stream of clients to Willow Creek Veterinary Clinic, each one seeming to have an extra reason to linger in the waiting room. Mrs. Peterson's cat needed vaccines, but she kept craning her neck toward the back room. Mr. Johnson claimed his dog had a limp, yet spent more time asking about unusual cases than discussing his pet's supposed injury. Kate handled the front desk with practiced patience, deflecting questions with gentle professionalism. "I understand your concern, but we need to focus on your pet's care right now." By mid-morning, Mrs. Henderson arrived for her cat's follow-up appointment. Her eyes darted around the examination room as Archer checked her elderly cat's arthritic joints. "Dr. Knowles," she said, unable to contain herself any longer, "people are saying you're keeping a dangerous wild animal here. Is it true?" Archer kept his voice steady. "Mrs. Henderson, I assure you all our patients receive appropriate care within proper guidelines." But Sarah at the grocery store said her cousin's friend drove by late at night and heard strange howling. The rumors had grown wilder than the pup itself. During lunch, Peter Mitchell stopped by, his expression concerned. "Archer, the talk at the diner's getting out of hand," Peter said, leaning against the counter. "Some folks are saying you've got a whole pack of wolves back there. Might be better to address it directly before things get worse." That evening, Archer found himself standing before a crowd at the community center. The hastily called town meeting packed the room with familiar faces, some worried, others angry. "This is a matter of public safety," Mr. Thompson called out from the back. "What if it escapes?" "Dr. Knowles has always put our community first," Mrs. Davis countered. "We should trust his judgment." Archer raised his hands for quiet. "I understand your concerns," he began, his voice carrying across the room. "A few weeks ago, a critically ill coyote pup was brought to my clinic. It required immediate medical care to survive. We've followed all proper protocols and arrangements have been made to transfer it to a licensed wildlife rehabilitation center." The room erupted in murmurs. Questions flew from all directions about safety, regulations, and responsibility. "The pup has remained in a secure enclosure," Archer continued, "under professional supervision. It poses no threat to our community." Some nodded in understanding, while others crossed their arms, unconvinced. The meeting stretched on as Archer patiently addressed each concern. When he finally returned to the clinic, exhaustion weighed heavy on his shoulders. The pup's excited yips greeted him as he checked its enclosure one last time. "At least you don't care what they say," he muttered with a faint smile before heading home. The shrill ring of Archer's phone pierced the quiet night. He fumbled for it in the darkness, his heart racing when he saw Kate's name on the screen. "Archer, you need to come now," Kate's voice trembled. "The pup, it's having trouble breathing. I don't know what happened. 1 minute it was fine, and then, "I'm on my way," he said, already pulling on his shoes. The drive to the clinic felt endless. Archer's knuckles were white on the steering wheel as streetlights flashed past. When he burst through the clinic doors, he found Kate in the back room, cradling the tiny coyote pup. Its chest heaved with shallow, rapid breaths, and small whimpers escaped between gasps. "How long has it been like this?" Archer asked, quickly washing his hands. "About 20 minutes, Kate replied, her face pale with worry. "I was doing the evening check when I noticed the labored breathing." They worked in practice synchronization. Archer gathered supplies while Kate gently placed the pup in the oxygen chamber. The creature's tiny body shook with each breath, its usually bright eyes now dull and half-closed. "Hand me the broad-spectrum antibiotic," Archer instructed, preparing a small syringe. Kate passed it to him, then adjusted the oxygen flow. Minutes stretched into hours. The quiet of the clinic was broken only by the steady hum of medical equipment and the pup's strained breathing. Kate monitored vital signs while Archer prepared fluid therapy to combat dehydration. "Temperature's still high," Kate murmured, checking the thermometer. 103.8. They took turns watching the pup, neither willing to leave its side. The night seemed endless, marked by careful adjustments to medication and oxygen levels, gentle encouragement, and shared worried glances. As the night sky began to lighten, the first signs of improvement appeared. The pup's breathing became less labored, its temperature slowly dropping. "Look," Kate whispered, pointing to the monitor. "Stats are improving." Archer nodded, relief washing over him as he checked the readings. The pup's fever was breaking, its breathing steadier with each passing minute. When the first rays of sunlight filtered through the clinic windows, Archer stood by the counter, watching the now peaceful form of the sleeping pup in its enclosure. The tiny chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm, so different from the desperate gasps of hours before. "You're tougher than you look, little one," he whispered, exhaustion evident in his voice but tempered by cautious hope. The morning sun streamed through the clinic windows as Archer dialed Dr. Novak's number, his fingers tapping nervously against his desk. His voice was weary from the sleepless night as he described the pup's health crisis, detailing every symptom and treatment he'd administered. "These setbacks aren't uncommon in young wildlife," Dr. Novak assured him, her calm voice steadying his nerves. "The Rehabilitation Center has excellent veterinary staff and facilities. They deal with critical cases regularly, and they've handled far more complex situations." "I just want to make sure they're prepared," Archer said, watching the pup sleep peacefully in its enclosure, its small chest rising and falling rhythmically. "After last night's scare, they're the best equipped to handle this transition," she replied firmly but kindly. "You've done your part, Archer. Now it's time to let them do theirs. Trust in their expertise." After the call, Archer and Kate began preparing for the next day's transfer, moving through the clinic with practiced efficiency. Kate organized the medical records, carefully documenting every treatment and observation, while Archer counted out medication doses, carefully labeling each container with detailed instructions and possible contingencies. "Should we pack extra antibiotics?" Kate asked, reviewing their checklist for the third time that morning. Her attention to detail matched his own. "Good thinking," Archer nodded, adding another vial to the kit. "Better to be over-prepared." In the afternoon, they brought the pup to the clinic's enclosed yard, watching it take tentative steps into the autumn air. The space was secure, surrounded by tall fencing and scattered with fallen leaves that created a natural playground. The pup's ears perked up at the outdoor sounds, its nose twitching at new scents as it gained confidence with each step. They watched as it explored, moving with surprising agility despite its recent health scare. When a leaf skittered past in the breeze, The pup dropped into a hunting crouch, its movements precise and instinctive, just like its wild cousins. A distant bird call made its ears swivel, body tensing in response, ready for action. "Look at those hunting instincts," Kate said softly, pride evident in her voice. "Hard to believe this is the same tiny thing Peter brought in, barely able to lift its head." "It's grown so much," Archer agreed, watching the pup pounce on another leaf with perfect precision. His chest tightened with a mixture of pride and sadness, knowing their time together was drawing to a close. The pup paused its exploration, nose lifted to catch a distant scent, its whiskers quivering in the breeze. Its wild nature showed in every movement, the alert posture, the careful stalking, the quick reactions to environmental sounds. Each action proved it was meant for something greater than life in captivity. "It's ready," Kate said, her voice catching slightly as she brushed away a tear. "As much as it hurts to admit, this little one belongs in the wild. We can't keep it from its true nature." Archer nodded, unable to speak for a moment as they watched the pup investigate a butterfly that had landed nearby, its movements showing both curiosity and natural predatory grace. When evening settled over the clinic, painting the sky in soft purples and oranges, the pup was back in its enclosure, curled up in a tight ball. Its breathing was steady and strong, so different from the previous night's crisis that had left them all on edge. Archer sat in his chair nearby, watching the gentle rise and fall of its chest, memorizing every detail. "Tomorrow's your big day," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion as he realized this would be their last night together. The morning light cast long shadows across the clinic's parking lot as a white van with the Wildlife Rehabilitation Services logo pulled up. Two team members, Sarah and Mike, stepped out, their movements practiced and efficient. They greeted Archer and Kate with understanding smiles, having handled many similar transfers before. "Dr. Knowles?" "I'm Sarah Chen, lead rehabilitator," the taller woman said, extending her hand. "We've reviewed the files Dr. Novak sent over." Inside the clinic, Mike carefully examined the pup while Sarah went through the medical records with Archer. Kate handed over the labeled medications and detailed feeding instructions. "The health scare last night? Will that be an issue?" Archer asked, watching Mike gently check the pup's breathing. "Not at all," Sarah assured him. "We're well equipped to handle any complications." They brought out a specially designed transport carrier lined with soft blankets. Mike lifted the pup with experienced hands, placing it inside. The pup let out a small whimper, but quickly settled, curling up on the blankets. Archer and Kate followed the van along winding roads to the rehabilitation center. The facility spread across several acres, nestled against thick forest. Modern enclosures dotted the landscape, each designed to mirror natural habitats. Dr. Novak met them at the entrance, clipboard in hand. "Welcome to what we call Halfway House for our wild friends," she said warmly. She led them to a viewing area overlooking a large enclosure where several young coyotes played. "This will be your little one's new home for now," Dr. Novak explained. "We'll introduce it gradually, monitoring its interactions." They watched as Mike carefully carried the carrier into the enclosure. The pup emerged cautiously, its nose twitching at the unfamiliar scents. It paced the perimeter, keeping distance from the other coyotes while studying them intently. "This hesitation is perfectly normal," Dr. Novak assured them. "Watch." Slowly, the pup began showing interest in its peers. It crept closer, responding to their playful movements. When one young coyote approached, the pup sniffed cautiously before giving a tentative tail wag. "See that?" Dr. Novak pointed out. "Those are excellent signs. It's already displaying natural social behaviors." As they prepared to leave, Archer and Kate paused at the viewing area for one last look. The pup turned toward them briefly, its familiar eyes meeting theirs. Then, responding to a playful yip from another coyote, it bounded away to join the group. Archer felt his throat tighten, a complex mixture of sadness and pride washing over him. Kate squeezed his arm gently, her own eyes glistening as they watched the pup disappear into its new life. The young coyote pup crept toward the water trough, its paws making soft impressions in the dirt. Every few steps it paused, ears twitching at the rustling leaves and distant bird calls. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rehabilitation center's enclosure, where several other coyotes lounged or played. As the pup lowered its head to drink, a slightly larger coyote nearby let out a low growl. The sound vibrated through the air, a clear message of dominance. The pup's muscles tensed, but it held its ground, taking quick, careful sips while keeping one eye on its companion. Dr. Novak stood at her observation post, clipboard in hand, meticulously recording every interaction. Over the past few days, she'd watched the pup's gradual transformation from timid newcomer to an increasingly confident member of the group. Though initially yielding to the others, it had begun claiming small victories, a preferred sleeping spot near a fallen log, or prime position during feeding time. The afternoon brought a significant test. During the daily feeding, a larger, more aggressive coyote challenged the pup over a chunk of meat. Hackles raised. The bigger coyote advanced with bared teeth. The pup immediately backed away, retreating to the edge of the enclosure. Dr. Novak watched intently as the pup observed from a distance, its head low but alert. After several minutes, it began a careful approach, circling wide around the feeding area. While the larger coyote was distracted by another scuffle, the pup darted in quickly, snatched the forgotten piece of meat, and carried it to a quiet corner. "Remarkable problem solving," Dr. Novak murmured, making detailed notes. When Archer arrived later that afternoon, Dr. Novak shared her observations with evident enthusiasm. They stood at the viewing area, watching the pup navigate its new social dynamics. "See how it's learning to read the others?" Dr. Novak pointed out. "It's developing essential survival skills." Archer nodded, his expression a mixture of pride and worry as he watched the pup dodge and weave through a playful chase with two other young coyotes. The creature he'd nursed back to health was transforming before his eyes, its movements becoming more fluid, more wild. As the sun began to set, casting orange light across the enclosure, the evening chorus began. One by one, the coyotes lifted their voices in haunting calls. The pup stood still, ears pricked forward, listening. Then, hesitantly at first, it raised its head and joined in, its higher-pitched voice blending with the others in an ancient song. "You're finding your place," Archer whispered, watching the pup's silhouette against the darkening sky. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rehabilitation center as the staff prepared to move the young coyotes. A large transport cage waited by the entrance of the new enclosure, its door wide open. Inside, the pack of juvenile coyotes shifted restlessly, their eyes bright with anticipation. When the cage door opened to the new enclosure, most of the young coyotes bounded out immediately, eager to explore. But Archer's pup hung back, its nose twitching at the unfamiliar scents carried on the morning breeze. The new space stretched out before them, a sprawling expanse of tall grass, scattered rocks, and native shrubs designed to mimic their natural habitat. After a few cautious moments, the pup took its first tentative steps onto the grass. Its paws sank slightly into the soft earth, so different from the packed dirt of the previous enclosure. Each step brought new scents and sensations, and gradually its confidence grew. Dr. Novak and her team watched from the observation platform as they introduced the day's training exercise. A staff member carefully released a field mouse into the enclosure, its tiny form darting through the grass. The other young coyotes immediately gave chase, their instincts kicking in. The pup observed at first, head low and ears forward, tracking the movement of both prey and packmates. Then, something clicked. In a burst of speed, it joined the hunt, its movements precise and calculated. Unlike the others who charged straight ahead, the pup circled wide, cutting off the mouse's escape route. "Remarkable," Dr. Novak murmured, scribbling notes. "It's showing advanced hunting strategies." Later that afternoon, when Archer arrived for an update, a staff member showed him photos of the morning's activities. His eyes lingered on an image of the pup mid-chase, its body stretched out in full pursuit. "It's doing better than we expected," the staff member said warmly. "Most rescued pups take weeks to adjust to this stage." Archer nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "I worried, after everything it went through." Dr. Novak joined them, placing a gentle hand on Archer's shoulder. "Want to know something?" she asked. "That pup might never have survived without your intervention. Yes, letting go was hard, but you gave it a real chance at life." Archer watched through the observation window as the pup explored its new territory. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, silhouetting the small hill where the pup now sat. Its head tilted back, and a clear, confident howl rose into the evening air, echoing across the wilderness. The bell above the clinic's door chimed as Emily Rogers stepped inside, her notebook tucked under her arm and a camera hanging from her neck. Her eyes sparkled with curiosity as she approached the front desk, where Archer was reviewing patient files. "Doctor Knowles? I'm Emily Rogers from the Willow Creek Gazette," she said, extending her hand. "I've been hearing quite a story about a special patient of yours." Archer hesitated, setting down his pen. The last few weeks had been a whirlwind of rumors and speculation. "I'm not sure there's much to tell," he said carefully. "The whole town's talking about it," Emily pressed gently. "Maybe it's time they heard the real story, from someone who actually knows what happened." After a moment's consideration, Archer nodded. "All right," he said, gesturing toward his office. "But this isn't just about an interesting story. There's an important message here about wildlife and conservation." In his office, Emily listened intently as Archer described finding the weak, struggling coyote pup. His voice grew animated as he detailed the sleepless nights, the breakthrough moments, and the bittersweet decision to transfer it to the rehabilitation center. "The hardest part," Archer explained, "was remembering that sometimes the best way to help wild animals is to let them be wild." Emily's article appeared in the next edition of the Gazette, titled, "Local Vets' Compassion Leads to Second Chance for Wild Pup." The piece detailed not just the rescue, but the larger importance of wildlife rehabilitation and proper protocols for handling wild animals. The response was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. Throughout the day, locals stopped by the clinic, sharing words of support and appreciation. Some brought coffee or baked goods. Others simply wanted to shake Archer's hand. Mrs. Henderson bustled in during the afternoon rush, clutching a copy of the newspaper. "Well, I must say," she announced loudly, "you've done our town proud, Doctor Knowles. Who knew we had such a wildlife expert in our midst?" That evening, Archer sat at his desk, the newspaper spread out before him. The photo accompanying the article showed the pup in its new habitat at the rehabilitation center, standing tall and alert among its peers. His fingers traced the image lightly as he reread Emily's words, describing the journey from that first desperate night to the pup's successful integration with its own kind. A small smile crossed his face as he folded the newspaper carefully and placed it in his desk drawer. The autumn morning painted the forest in shades of gold and amber as Archer's truck pulled into the sanctuary's gravel parking lot. He found Kate and Dr. Novak already there, helping the rehabilitation staff load equipment into their vehicles. The crisp air carried the scent of fallen leaves and pine needles, nature's reminder that change was coming. "Perfect morning for a release," Dr. Novak said, checking her clipboard. "The weather conditions are ideal, and the territory surveys show plenty of natural prey in the area." Kate helped load the last of the transport carriers while Archer reviewed the release protocols with the staff. His eyes kept drifting to the enclosure where the coyotes waited. The pup, now a sleek, healthy adult, paced with practiced grace, its golden eyes alert and focused. The convoy of vehicles made its way deeper into the wilderness, following a narrow dirt road until they reached the chosen release site. The staff worked efficiently, setting up temporary holding pens that opened directly into the dense forest. Archer helped position the barriers, his movements deliberate and careful. One by one, the coyotes were transferred to the release pens. The former pup moved with confidence, its muscles rippling beneath thick fur. When its turn came, it paused at the threshold of the open gate, ears pricked forward at the sounds of the forest. For a moment it turned its head, meeting Archer's gaze. In those eyes, Archer saw no trace of the fragile creature Peter had brought to his clinic months ago. This was a wild animal, ready to claim its birthright. With fluid grace, the coyote stepped forward into the wilderness. Its form melted into the dappled shadows of the forest, leaving only rustling leaves in its wake. Moments later, a clear, confident howl echoed through the trees. "That's exactly what we want to hear," Dr. Novak said, placing a reassuring hand on Archer's shoulder. "The vocalization indicates it's already connecting with the local population. Your pup has all the skills it needs now." Kate and Archer stood at the forest's edge as the staff began packing up the equipment. More howls joined the first, creating a wild chorus that seemed to make the very air vibrate. Kate wiped a tear from her cheek. "We did right by him," she said softly. Archer nodded, his throat tight with emotion as the haunting songs of the coyotes filled the autumn air. A week after the release, Willow Creek Veterinary Clinic hummed with its familiar rhythm. Archer knelt beside Max, an elderly chocolate Labrador who'd been visiting the clinic for years. His gentle hands moved along the dog's joints, checking for signs of increased stiffness. "The new medication seems to be helping," he told Mrs. Peterson, Mac's owner. "See how he's putting more weight on that back leg?" Across the room, Kate sat cross-legged on the floor, speaking in soft tones to 7-year-old Sarah, while her orange tabby Mittens cowered in his carrier. "Sometimes cats get nervous at the vet," Kate explained, demonstrating how to stroke Mittens in a way that would calm him. "Just like people get butterflies before seeing their doctor." The waiting room door chimed as another client entered, adding to the chorus of barks, meows, and friendly chatter that filled the space. The familiar sounds wrapped around Archer like a comfortable blanket. The click of paws on tile floors, the rustle of treat bags, and the gentle murmur of concerned pet owners. During a brief lull between appointments, Archer found himself staring at the empty corner where the coyote pup's enclosure had stood. The space seemed larger now, somehow emptier. His mind drifted to those early days, the tiny creature fighting for survival, those first tentative tail wags, the late-night feedings that had left him exhausted but determined. He remembered the pup's golden eyes watching him work, the way it would yip softly when he entered the room. The corner might be empty now, but it held a wealth of memories that Archer knew he'd carry forever. Kate noticed his distant expression and crossed the room. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, understanding written across her face. "I miss him too," she said quietly. Archer nodded, grateful for her presence and shared experience. They stood in comfortable silence, both remembering the little wild creature that had changed their lives in unexpected ways. The daily work of helping animals still brought him joy, but the pup's journey had taught him something special about letting go and trusting in nature's path. As night fell, Archer completed his closing routine, checking supplies, filing the day's charts, and making sure all the boarding animals were comfortable. At the clinic's entrance, he paused with his hand on the light switch. Through the glass door, he could see the stars scattered across the dark sky, their light clear and bright above the sleeping town. His eyes drifted toward the distant tree line, where the forest melted into shadow. Somewhere under those same stars, a young coyote ran free, exactly where it belonged. Archer settled into his office chair early that autumn morning, steam rising from his coffee mug as he opened his laptop. The crisp air outside had painted the clinic windows with a light frost, and the heating system hummed quietly in the background. His email inbox chimed with a new message, and Dr. Novak's name caught his eye. The subject line made his heart skip. "Your little survivor. Update." His cursor hovered over the email for a moment before he clicked, anticipation and nostalgia mixing in his chest. The first photo loaded slowly, revealing a magnificent adult coyote standing tall on a rocky outcrop. Its fur gleamed golden in the sunlight, thick and healthy. Archer leaned closer to his screen, hardly believing this confident creature was once the fragile pup he'd nursed back to health. More photos followed, the coyote leading a small pack through tall grass, teaching younger members to hunt and patrolling their territory with assured steps. Dr. Novak's notes detailed the animal's remarkable progress. "Your former patient has exceeded all expectations. The pack naturally gravitates to his leadership, and his hunting success rate is impressive." "Kate," Archer called out, his voice catching slightly. "Come see this." Kate hurried in, still wearing her blue surgical scrubs. She gasped as Archer scrolled through the photos. Tears welled in her eyes, but her smile was radiant. "He's doing exactly what he was meant to do," she said softly, touching the screen where the coyote's image showed him guiding his pack through a meadow. Archer printed his favorite photo, the one of the coyote on the rocky outcrop, head held high against a blue sky. He found an unused frame in his desk drawer and carefully placed the image inside, positioning it next to his computer where he could see it every day. Later that evening, Peter Mitchell's familiar heavy boots echoed down the clinic hallway. He'd stopped by after his rounds, as he often did, and found Archer in his office. "Got something to show you," Archer said, picking up the framed photo. Peter's weathered face broke into a broad grin as he studied the image. "Would you look at that?" he exclaimed. "Remember how tiny he was when I found him?" He shook his head in amazement. "I knew from the moment I found him, he was a fighter." Archer prepared 2 cups of coffee from the clinic's small kitchen, and they raised their mugs in a quiet toast to the wild creature that had brought them all together. The Willow Creek Community Center hummed with life on a chilly Friday evening. Colorful autumn decorations adorned the walls, and familiar faces filled the rows of folding chairs. Archer shifted uncomfortably in a seat near the back, tugging at his tie. He'd only come because Kate had insisted, claiming the town needed to celebrate its local heroes. "Stop fidgeting," Kate whispered from beside him, smoothing her own dress. "You look fine." Mayor Thompson stood at the podium, her voice carrying through the room as she recognized various community members for their contributions. Archer half listened, his mind drifting to the stack of patient files waiting at the clinic. "And now," the mayor's voice cut through his thoughts, "I'd like to recognize someone who reminded us all what it means to be stewards of our natural world. Dr. Archer Knowles, Would you please join me?" Archer froze. Kate gave him a gentle nudge, and he rose slowly, making his way to the front. The wooden floorboards creaked under his feet as scattered applause filled the room. Mayor Thompson held up a gleaming plaque. "For extraordinary dedication to wildlife preservation and demonstrating the power of compassion in action," she read, then handed it to him with a warm smile. Archer gripped the podium, his hand slightly trembling. "Thank you," he began, his voice soft but steady. "What happened with that little coyote wasn't just about saving one animal. It was about understanding our responsibility to the wild creatures we share this land with." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "Every life matters, whether it's someone's beloved pet or a wild animal in need. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can make the biggest difference." From the middle row, Mrs. Henderson's voice rang out clear as a bell. "I always knew you'd do right by that little thing." Laughter rippled through the crowd, breaking the formal atmosphere. Archer couldn't help but smile. After the ceremony, people gathered around the refreshment table, sharing stories and congratulations. Archer found himself surrounded by townsfolk, many expressing newfound respect for his work. Old Mr. Peterson talked about spotting coyotes on his farm, now viewing them with curiosity instead of suspicion. Sarah from the grocery store asked about volunteering at the clinic. Kate watched from nearby, pride evident in her expression as Archer handled each conversation with patience and grace. He'd come so far from the reserved veterinarian who'd first arrived in Willow Creek. When the crowd began to thin, Archer slipped outside onto the community center's front steps. The night air felt cool against his face, and stars dotted the clear sky above. The plaque in his hands caught the moonlight, making the engraved words shimmer. Kate's footsteps approached, and she settled beside him on the steps. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the crickets and distant owl calls. "You've inspired a lot of people," she said softly. Archer smiled faintly, his eyes on the starlit horizon. "It wasn't just me. That little guy inspired all of us." The autumn wind rustled through the trees as Archer and Kate made their way along Wheeler's Ridge Trail. Fallen leaves in shades of gold and crimson crunched beneath their hiking boots. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the rich scent of damp earth and pine. "Hard to believe it's been months," Kate said, adjusting her backpack. "Remember how tiny he was when Peter first brought him in?" Archer nodded, stepping over a fallen branch. "Barely bigger than my hand." His eyes scanned the familiar terrain, recognizing landmarks from their previous visit. As they reached the ridge's summit, Archer stopped, breathing in deeply. Below them stretched an endless canvas of autumn colors, the forest extending as far as the eye could see. He leaned against a weathered oak tree, his gaze distant. "I wonder where he is now," he mused aloud. "Out there somewhere, maybe with his own pack." Kate set down her backpack and pulled out a red-checkered blanket. "Let's take a break here," she suggested, spreading it over a dry patch of ground. They settled onto the blanket, and Kate unpacked their simple picnic: thermoses of hot coffee, sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, and 2 crisp apples. The peaceful silence was broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and distant birdsong. Suddenly, a long, clear howl echoed through the valley. Both Archer and Kate froze, their coffee cups halfway to their lips. The single call was joined by others, creating a wild harmony that filled the air. The sound was haunting and beautiful, speaking of freedom and wild places. Archer and Kate exchanged glances, neither speaking. The same hope reflected in their eyes, that somewhere in that chorus was their little survivor, strong and free, leading his pack in song. They sat motionless, letting the wild symphony wash over them. The moment felt sacred somehow, filled with a deep sense of peace and accomplishment. As the howls faded into the distance, Archer packed away their picnic items with careful movements, as if not wanting to break the spell of the moment. They started their descent down the trail, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows through the trees. Kate's hand found Archer's as they walked. He looked at her and smiled softly. "We gave him his chance," he said quietly, "and he took it." The chorus of howls echoed once more in the distance as they made their way through the golden woods, their footsteps light on the leaf-strewn path. If you enjoyed the story of Archer, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.